My name is Khalil Jahshan, and I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington. We're very honored today to have convened with us a distinguished group of academics and practitioners who have come together from diverse perspectives and experiences and even geographical locales. I can see people already in the room, and others are joining us later who have come from Europe and from as far as the Middle East also. We've come together to examine the dynamics shaping freedom of expression and cyber geopolitics in the Arab world today. While social media tools and communication technologies have played a central role in uprising and democracy, uprising for seeking democracy, they have also become effective and unfortunately repressive tools of choice in the hands of the repressive authoritarian regimes that seem to be resisting back throughout the region. If I were to summarize the state of affairs with regards to media and freedom of the press in the Middle East in general and the Arab world in particular, I would have to say, in the tradition of State of the Union exercises in this town, most of them are futile, but I'll try to be a little bit more useful than that by saying that the state of affairs with regards to media and freedom of expression in the Middle East is not well today as we speak. The reason I say that, because it is our belief, not just personal, but as a center that focuses on research on the region where the issues of human rights and freedom of expression particularly are important to us. When we look at for example, media freedom in the Middle East today, and we see that 3 of the top 4 countries, for example, in jailing journalists today are from the region, namely Turkey, Egypt, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. When I look at the most recent report from Reporters Without Borders, their ranking known as the World Press Freedom Index for 2019, comparing 180 countries in this respect and scoring them, most of the Arab world fits in the bottom 20 of the 180 list. Actually, 10 Arab countries are way down in the bottom of that list. Only 3 Arab countries fit made it in the top 100, and 0 made it to the top 50 on that list. So it's very dismal. The only 3 that made it in the top 100 are Comoros and Mauritania and Tunisia, which shows the link, I guess, in terms of Tunisia, between yearning for democracy and an increase in freedom of expression. There is a session today at noon that will be dealing with the issue of the Khashoggi murder. As you will know, Jamal Khashoggi was a friend personally and a friend of the center, and he spoke from this podium for the center before. And it is kind of fascinating. I couldn't help but think in preparing for this conference, his last article, the last essay that he wrote for the Washington Post, in which he said, most of the people living in Arab countries are either uninformed or misinformed on political events. They are unable to adequately address, much less publicly discuss, matters that affect the region and their day-to-day lives. He concluded, a state-run narrative dominates the public psyche, and while many do not believe it, a large majority of the population falls victim to this false narrative, end of quote. I think it is quotes like this and analysis like this that probably cost him his life, which is very regretful, but we will be talking about that later in the program. So currently, when you look around the region and you see events, particularly the last few weeks in Lebanon and Iraq, and other countries, the Arab world finds itself facing a renewed wave of protests seeking potentially a democratizing outcome in the region. Of course, this is juxtaposed with the robust form of totalitarian rule, including increased targeting of journalists and activists in spite of these upheavals, or maybe due to these upheavals. It is against this backdrop, and with the knowledge and hope that the future of democracy and human rights in the Arab world will be significantly impacted by the uses of new media tools and technologies in the political and geopolitical spheres, that we have dedicated this fourth annual conference at the center to explore the role of the media and new technologies in advancing human rights and democracy in the Arab world. So on behalf of our colleagues at Arab Center worldwide, our colleagues in Doha, our colleagues in Beirut, our colleagues in Paris and in Tunisia, our board of directors here locally in Washington, and my colleagues, our staff at the Washington office, and myself, please allow me at this time to welcome you to this event and express my personal pleasure that you have chosen to be here to engage with us and with your colleagues on the program, with one another on this very critical topic. We hope that you will find the program and the discussions throughout the day today insightful, thought-provoking, and most importantly, of practical use applicable, because we do not want to focus just on the diagnosis. I mean, in looking around the room, I see experts in the region all over the place in different fields of specialties, but we would like to hopefully by the end of the day come up with some practical ideas on how to enhance the media and democracy, freedom of expression in the region. Before introducing our keynote speaker this morning, let me please announce a couple of announcements, housekeeping matters that would appreciate your cooperation in this regard. First of all, your questions are solicited and welcome throughout the day. There will be Q&A sessions every panel throughout the day. However, our tradition at Arab Center is to do that in writing, so that's why there are cards in front of you and pens or pencils to do that. If you have a question particularly or a short comment to make, please clearly indicate your name, affiliation, and ask your question, address it to the speaker or to a panelist in later session, panelist of your choice. They will be collected. Once you have a question, just raise the card. Staff will pick it up and bring it forward, and I will be more than delighted to read it on one condition, that I can read it. So make sure I do function in several languages, but hieroglyphics is not one of them, so do not try that on me, otherwise your question will be ignored. Second one, the conference hashtags on Twitter are hashtag Arab Center 2019 and hashtag Arab Media. Please follow and join the conversation online. And finally, please help us to minimize any disruption by silencing your phones during all sessions today, starting now. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a genuine honor for me to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, who is uniquely qualified to speak on this issue of freedom of expression, both actually in the Middle East as well as here in the United States. Marc Lamont Hill is an award-winning journalist, professor of media studies, and a leading intellectual voice in the United States. Dr. Hill has been a nationally renowned social justice activist, an organizer for most of his professional life. He has authored and co-authored many publications and edited several books, and has received numerous prestigious awards for his work, including being named by Ebony magazine as one of America's 100 most influential Black leaders. Marc is actually trained as an anthropologist of education. He holds a PhD degree from the University of Pennsylvania. And his research throughout his academic career has focused on the intersection between culture, politics, and education in the United States and beyond, including the Middle East. More detailed bio is available in your program book. I will not take your time or take his time from speaking to say more things. I do have more things to say about him, but please join me at this time in welcoming Marc Lamont Hill.
Thank you, Khalid. Good morning, everyone. It is, excuse my voice. The Nationals won the World Series last night. So, as a Philadelphian, I spent the night booing, so I'm a little, Bryce Harper and I. It is a real honor to be here this morning with you, to have the opportunity to talk and think about such a significant issue, such an important question, thank you, of freedom of speech and the broader conversation around democracy in the media. As a professor of media studies and as someone who thinks deeply about the media, I think that we all have the grandest aspirations, the grandest hopes. We assign our deepest expectations of democratic possibility to the media. That is to say that any vision we have of equality or of justice or of freedom or of democracy, we attach it to some extent, the media. We believe that the more robust a media sphere we have, the more diverse a media we have, the more capable a media we have, the more unrestricted a media we have, the more likely we will have access to all the spoils of democratic citizenship. If we can simply tell our truths, if we can hold power accountable, if we can investigate, if we can locate solutions, we can only expand on democratic possibilities, not just here, but around the globe. And that is why the numbers of countries, of nation states, of communities that have media landscapes that are the opposite of that is so depressing. When Khalil talks about Turkey or Egypt or, of course, Saudi, it can become alarming, jarring even to our minds and our democratic sensibilities to understand that there are countries where freedom of speech, critique of the government, et cetera, is completely unrestricted, or excuse me, completely restricted. But sometimes you have to return home. It's easy to look at a CC government or, for all intents and purposes, an MBS government and say, look how unfree they are. Look at the lack of freedom there. But to not be critically and self-reflective of the ways in which the United States also forecloses on democratic possibilities through the media. Now, one difference when we talk about the United States is that the freedom of expression is a constitutional affordance. It's something that we all have access to in theory. There is, however, a gap as a matter of practice oftentimes between what freedom is supposed to be and what freedom looks like. Freedom isn't just constrained through repressive state apparatuses. That is to say, freedom isn't just restrained by an army or a navy. It's not always a machine gun or a police baton that prevents us from speaking our truths. It's not always a prison cell that is the thing that discourages us from being able to articulate powerful truths against the powerful. Sometimes our freedom of expression is restricted through those means, to be sure. We've seen that with reporters who have been jailed here in the United States, but it's also restrained by far more pragmatic and practical matters. Sometimes we don't speak truths because of the consequences of speaking truths. It's sort of easy to critique the Trump administration now. There's no shortage of Trump critics right now on any side of the aisle. I'm not even sure that it's a partisan matter to be critical of Donald Trump. But there are moments over the last 2 or 3 years where critiques of Trump have been quite partisan, and where there are moments where it was much more easy to critique Trump on policy matters versus personal matters. There are moments where it's possible to highlight or celebrate a particular candidate or ignore another one. The political landscape shifts from time to time, and the political but also professional consequences of articulating particular critiques or covering certain campaigns or exposing certain scandals have different consequences, and we have to be honest about that. And there are also ways that our freedom of expression is restricted or constrained at a much more deep level. The academic in me wants to talk about the discursive limits of freedom of speech. The way in which our frames of knowledge and our frames of reference foreclose on the possibility that we could even consider other outcomes, that we could even offer other analyses, that we could even decide whether a story matters or not. I mean, that's part of the challenge of what freedom of expression means, is that sometimes it gets so limited and constrained at the intellectual level that we don't even consider putting something as a lead on our television broadcast, or we don't allow something to be a headline in a newspaper, not because anyone is standing there saying, hey, you can't talk about this particular bombing over here, but you can talk about that bombing over there. It's because we've already been constrained in such a way, intellectually, politically, and professionally, that we don't even consider it. But the Middle East, because I've been speaking in sort of general terms, but the Middle East, that is particularly challenging. It's particularly vexing for anyone interested in media to think about how these freedoms of expression are limited. For me, my story comes, you might have heard of it. I used to work at a place, Cable News Network, that's the name of it, and I gave a speech at the United Nations about almost a year ago. And after I spoke at the UN on the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, and I gave a 24-ish minute speech talking about the conditions on the ground in Israel, Palestine. I am a trained anthropologist. I have spent years now on the ground in the region. I specifically study race and identity and citizenship in Palestine. And I specifically spend most of my time in Jerusalem, but a significant amount of time in other parts of the West Bank as well, specifically Ramallah and Khalil. I'm also an activist. I also have led delegations there. I have spent a significant amount of time studying the issue, and I was brought to the UN actually as a representative of civil society to talk about what I saw on the ground. I didn't expect it to be a controversial matter. Certainly didn't expect to get fired the next day. Would have made some different choices, you know. But not about the speech, about other things, you know. Wouldn't have gotten the MBA package, you know. But I gave a speech, and at the end of the speech, there was much controversy, apparently, about 6 words in the speech that people found objectionable. Not the substantive critique of human rights, not the critique of the court system, not the talk about settlement expansion, not the analysis of the violation of human rights on the ground. None of that was called into question My appeal to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of established in 1948, and the comparison of the conditions on the ground to those universally declared human rights, none of that was called into question. And so I was a bit surprised the next day when I got a phone call that I could no longer work for this cable news network because the words of my speech were not in line with their values. This is the exact quote. Your speech was not in line with our values. Which values? Seemed like a reasonable follow-up. All of them. This is a bizarre conversation. The most bizarre conversation I've ever had in my life. Just all of them. Well, which part of the speech? Because I'm assuming they're talking about the last 6 words of the speech, or maybe 8, where I said free Palestine from the river to the sea, which for them was I'll get into this a little bit, what they considered to be an anti-Semitic remark. That the appeal to calling for a free Palestine from the river to the sea was anti-Semitic because it was calling to remove Jewish people from the land, and or it was seen as a subtle allusion to Hamas. And so by saying free Palestine from the river to the sea, I was tacitly or maybe explicitly supporting Hamas, and because they believe that Hamas is a terrorist organization, I am therefore a terrorist of sorts, at least rhetorically, and as such, I do not belong on the network. Now, they didn't say all of that. They just said your speech isn't in line with our values, and they refused to comment further. The conversation ended, and the last 11 months have proceeded in really interesting and bizarre ways. And for me, that was an interesting moment to give a speech to give remarks off air as a private citizen, to offer a political analysis and a political critique, but to be not allowed on the air because the particular formation of my politics was out of step with what they wanted me to do, out of step with a particular type of orthodoxy, for me was problematic and certainly a violation of free speech. Now, I would concede that, of course, if I owned a cable news network and someone were anti-Semitic, I would not want them on my network. I would not allow them on my network. There's no part of my political analysis, no part of my moral or ethical vocabulary, there's no part of my personal makeup that advocates or supports anti-Semitism. I reject anti-Semitism at all turns, at all times, and in all ways. But that's where substance has to come into the conversation, right? It's not enough to simply say that something is anti-Semitic. We have to be willing to question whether something is anti-Semitic. And I would suggest to them, if we had had the benefit of a conversation, that river to the sea is a conversation that has been existing in historic Palestine for over a century, that the language of rivers to seas is not exclusive to Hamas, which is a relatively, in the scope of human history, new organization, that the Likud party, for example, in their platform statement in the 70s, talked about the river to the sea, that there are liberal parties, there are radical parties on both sides, there are Zionist organizations, or political parties, there are progressive or even radical pro-Palestinian organizations that all use the language of river to the sea. If you spend any time in the region, you will hear the words river and sea in that very context across the political landscape. But even the idea that Hamas somehow now has exclusive rights to that phrase is itself an outgrowth of a lack of area knowledge, a lack of close analysis, and a deep commitment to preventing any type of complicated conversation about this in the media, which itself is a certain type of restriction of freedom of speech. I don't want to talk to you this morning about my personal case. I'm okay. But I do think that there has to be space and time and intellectual room for a conversation about freedom of expression on this issue. What I want to talk about this morning, though, is some of the things that I think are preventing it. One thing is, and I wish it weren't this simple, it's racism. And I mean racism in the most broad way possible. We could be more specific and use the language of Orientalism. Sadly, the East, and in this case more specifically the Middle East, continues to be constructed in ways that define it as the moral, ethical, intellectual, and civilizational opposite of the West. We continue in news media too often to frame the Middle East as a space of anti-democracy, incomplete democracy, a lack of civilization, and flat-out barbarism. How many times do we watch mainstream media or listen to mainstream media talking points or political talking points where the politician says, this is an intractable battle? We heard y'all's president, somebody's president, probably nobody in this room, speaking just last week, we got to get out of there because they've been fighting forever. The discourse of they've been fighting forever, whether we're talking about Palestine, whether we're talking about Syria, whether we're talking about Iran, this language of they have been fighting forever simply reinforces the idea that there is a lack of possibility or capacity among Arab communities to engage in forms of peace. That there's never been a moment of stability or peace or nation building, that the decades of Arab nationalism, that the centuries of peace that have existed all throughout human history, but certainly within the modern era, are all to be ignored. This is a particular narrative. That narrative makes it very easy to not have a complicated or nuanced conversation about the Middle East. It forecloses on possibilities of expression at the discursive level because we don't even imagine the Middle East as a space of human agency, of a space of democratic possibility, of a space of freedom. But this is itself is a part of another issue, which is, again, a lack of area knowledge. It's absolutely stunning to sit in media newsrooms. And it's this, to sit in media newsrooms, whether it's television media, whether it's print media, and hear the lack of basic fundamental understandings of the issues that are at stake. Whether it's a news anchor, and I'm to be very clear, I'm not speaking of CNN right now. I'm speaking of every news outlet, most news outlets in America. I've learned to be very careful, or precise rather. But if you have news anchors that don't know the difference between Sunni and Shia, I mean, just basic fundamental things. If people don't understand the impact of major policy moments, major legislative shifts, major shifts in the organization of the world itself, it becomes very challenging to have any kind of conversation about the region. I was reading yesterday, there was an interview with Peter Jennings in 1975. And of course, Peter spent a great deal of time in Lebanon and actually was very well informed at the time, and he talked about the challenges in the newsroom of getting people to not call everybody Arabs. Meaning that knowing the difference between someone who was Lebanese and someone who was Syrian might be significant, that you can't just say there was a war in the Middle East and Arabs were fighting. Imagine that. And while we've certainly made progress from that moment, some progress from that moment, now we talk about specific groups of Arabs that are fighting. We still lack the level of nuance and political knowledge that we need in order to have a sophisticated conversation. And so when moments happen like the one at the UN, or when moments happen where there are debates on television, we don't have access to the type of information to adjudicate competing claims, to decide what's a legitimate argument and what is not, to be able to make a historically informed case for what is true and what is not true. We are simply unable to do that. Another issue is, and this is the nature particularly of news media today, is that there is little conversation about structure. There is little room to talk about institutions and structures. We're always in a moment of reaction. We're always in a moment where we are analyzing or responding to what has happened, to a particular conflict, to a particular policy moment, and we don't have, again, based partly on this lack of area knowledge, the ability to talk about the deeper and more fundamental structures that are in place that create the conditions for something to happen. What good is it to talk about an uprising in Gaza if we can't talk about what happened after the election of Hamas? How difficult is it to talk about the presence of Hamas if we can't talk about the conditions that created Hamas, if we can't talk about Oslo? What significance is it to the conversation about the West Bank if we don't talk about the Oslo Accords? how challenging is it to have a deep and fundamental analysis of Israel-Palestine, or of Saudi Arabia, or of any other country or circumstance or relationship or conflict in the Middle East if we don't understand formations of power, if we don't understand the relationship between the United States and the Middle East, if we don't understand the relations of power, if we don't understand the political economy of the Middle East, if we don't understand the role of the West in maintaining particular relations of power, these are all significant conversations that we are able to have with nuance and sophistication in the Middle East, in the West. We would never have a conversation in American news media about guns or gun control or about the Second Amendment and not have a conversation about the NRA. It would be absurd. It would be impossible to have a conversation about reproductive freedom and justice and not have an analysis of all of the groups, all the organizations, all the historical moments, all the major Supreme Court decisions that have shifted the conversation in one way or another. I'm not suggesting that on our 24-hour cable news cycle, we should be expecting major news anchors in the 30 seconds they have to be talking about the Balfour Declaration or the Hussein McMahon correspondences in great depth over 22 seconds. I ain't saying all that. But you should know what basic laws are. You should know that there are no established borders. You should know some fundamental stuff that informs the conversation. Because when you don't have that, you enter a moment that cable news in particular, but I would argue American media more broadly, loves to engage. And that is the next point. That is this obsession with parity, of saying there's one side over here and there's another side over there, and we're just going to debate it out. It makes for great TV. It makes for great debate. It's great on the blogs. But at some point, we have to have the intellectual and political honesty to say that all sides aren't created equal. I remember working at Huffington Post, and one of the great things that Ariana Huffington did was, she said, we are no longer going to have debates on climate change. Because to have a debate on climate change and to have the climate change denier over here and the person who believes in science over there, and to have them in a one-on-one debate is to legitimize a position that is not sustainable intellectually. It's dishonest. It makes for great TV. But it doesn't make for a more informed or intellectually responsible citizenry. Doesn't mean we silence voices that we don't agree with. But what it means is we have to hold them accountable to some sort of standard. But too often on the question of particularly Israel-Palestine, we say that these are two competing sides that have been fighting forever, and we're going to have one over here and one over there. And we ignore the fact that one is an occupying power. We ignore the fact that one is in violation of international law. And in doing so, we limit the possibilities of advancing the conversation. And those who attempt to intervene in that conversation in those ways, to hold power accountable wherever it is in the world, are professionally, socially, or intellectually marginalized. Their freedom of expression is limited. I've never gone on a cable news network. I've never written an article and been told you can't talk about this. I've never been told that I can't take the position that I want to take. There is no secret cabal of power. That would be a dangerous, and I would argue, anti-Semitic narrative. But there are intellectual limitations on the conversation that we have about the Middle East, not just Israel-Palestine, but about the Middle East. And we also have to be honest about that. We have to be honest about lobby groups. Again, there are no secret cabals of power, but there are lobby groups. There's lobby groups for guns. There's lobby groups for the anti-abortion movement. There are lobby groups on the question of Israel. And we have to be honest about the role that those organizations, those institutions, those particular belief systems play in how we have a conversation. It is no coincidence that when you debate somebody in the media on the question of gun control, they all have the same talking points. If you talk about school choice, they all have the same talking points. And certainly when I watch a Democratic debate and I hear Hillary Clinton, I'm talking about 2016, Hillary Clinton repeating the same AIPAC talking points that Donald Trump would eventually repeat after he got the memo, I then and again, when I say the memo, I mean literally Donald Trump received a memo the next day. The first day he was much more like, I'll be an arbiter of both sides. He said that he received a memo saying that he needed to be more stern and articulate his position on Israel differently, and he did. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump was influenced by power. I'm saying that may be Donald Trump's worldview. But what I'm saying is if we all have the same worldview and we all have the same talking points, then we can't have a robust conversation. There needs to be room for people with a different point of view and different talking points, and we have to be able to have that conversation on the public stage as well. But unfortunately, we don't have that. And some of it is our own commitment to the status quo and our refusal as politicians and as citizens and as journalists to indict or challenge the status quo. Many of us find social and political and even intellectual comfort in the arrangement of power whereby the United States exercises considerable control over the Middle East, where relations of capital continue to persist in the way that they do. We can, as a group of journalists or media people, be outraged at the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, but to what extent does that resonate with the broader public, and how can we change that conversation? How can we be willing to create a world where there isn't this type of fatigue? And lastly, there is considerable room within American media to talk about the reaction of the vulnerable. But there is very little room and space to critique the actions of the powerful. We'll talk about the Palestinian response. We'll talk about the Houthi response. But we must create room to have the initial analysis. We can have a critique of Hamas. Who doesn't have a critique of Hamas? Who doesn't have a critique of the Sultan? Who doesn't have a critique of the Palestinian Authority? These are legitimate critiques to have. You should. If we're being honest in the media, we have to have a critique of that. But I also need to have a critique of the conditions and the sets of institutional arrangements that and dynamics of power that created the occupation in the first place, that created dislocation and transfer and expulsion in the first place. That has to be the initial piece of the conversation that we have. I can't talk about the construction of the rebel as an idea and as an identity in the media if I don't talk about the role that Saudi might play or Bahrain might play in the construction or the violation of human rights. I can talk about the response that's happening in Lebanon, but what kind of institutional arrangements lead to demand the response in Lebanon? I can talk to the response to Mubarak, but what creates the response? What creates the conditions that normalize and legitimize Hosni Mubarak in the first place before we get to the moment in Tahrir? How do we have this happen? What are the conditions that we are willing to produce on the ground as media and journalists to allow people to have a deeper and more thoughtful structural and institutional analysis of the world? There's no room for that. So if we close all the possibilities of substance and nuance and depth and historical analysis, and all we have are two people fighting, then sure, this does look like an intractable problem. This does look too messy for us Americans to get involved in. This does look like it's above us now. And those few people who want to speak in a different way are seen as extremists, as outside the boundaries of civil discourse. And so the language of civility and politeness become excuses, they become pretexts for shrinking democratic dialogue. It is our job as those who either work in media or work with media to constantly push and challenge to expand the conversation, to add intellectual depth and nuance, to demand multiple representations of different people, to demand that, and what I mean by that is to demand that we don't just talk about Palestinians or about Syrians or about Lebanese people, but that we have people speak for themselves, that we don't speak as proxies for those people, that we allow people on the ground from those countries, from those regions to speak for themselves. It means that we allow multiple points of view, but we don't pretend that all points of view are created equal. It means that we no longer pretend to be objective adjudicators of truth. That's not to say that we're not fair. That doesn't mean that we're not balanced. It doesn't mean that we're not disciplined in our analysis. But what it means is we have to hold something accountable. We have to have a moral and ethical vocabulary that informs the work that we do. We have to prioritize and emphasize justice. We have to prioritize and emphasize democracy. And there are many ways to do that. In the ballot box, with our feet in the streets, with our voices, with our dollars. But there's also the media. This is our tool. The media is our weapon to expand truth and democracy and freedom and self-determination for everyone. But we have to be honest about the moment we're in. We have to be willing to roll up our sleeves and do the work to resist this moment and to create new possibilities for freedom and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc, for your very honest and challenging presentation for all of us to do more on this front. And I would like to begin by asking you, looking at this issue, the fact that, and the changes that we have undergone, particularly here in Washington, in terms of the domineering nature of U.S. policy in the region, and it still continues to preach and not practice democracy and freedom of expression in the region. What do you see as is there still a constructive role for the United States in this regard of freedom of expression and media? Or has the U.S. deteriorated over the past 20, 30, 40 years to becoming totally part of the problem and not part of the solution?
That's a wonderful question. I would push back against just part of the premise of the question, which was that 30 or 40 years ago, the United States was better. I think obviously there are ways that right. I think that there's always been a challenge, I would argue post-World War II, of the United States playing a constructive and healthy role in the Middle East more broadly, but specifically with regard to media and media representation. But I think you're right. I think the last 30 or 40 years has produced an even greater set of challenges in many ways. I think some of those challenges are countervailed by the new media technologies that you spoke about earlier, because at the very same time that we are forced into a fairly singular narrative about the Middle East, there's digital and social media that allow people on the ground to push back and to resist and to offer their own narratives and their own representations to counter-narrate what's happening. I didn't get the most profound understanding of what was happening on the ground in Egypt during the revolution from ABC or from CBS. I got it from Twitter. When I saw, before things were shut down, I got to see some interesting forms of resistance in Iran a few years ago. I'm watching what's happening in Lebanon, and I'm feeling excited from Instagram as much as I am from NBC. And so I'm not as pessimistic about this moment as I otherwise would be. That said, to the second part of your question, or maybe the first part, I think that the United States still does have the capacity to play a helpful role in the conversation around media and justice and democracy in the Middle East. I think it's about accountability. There are two things that we can do at the level of, not at the governmental level, but at the level of media institutions. We simply have to have a more robust conversation. That happens from investing in it. There's still the possibility, just like there is at any moment, of changing. There was a time where the networks were chasing down a missing airplane for 3 months simply because it made for good TV. We have to, when white women go missing, we deploy all of our resources to finding them for months at a time on cable news because it makes for good TV. if we can do a better job of creating the appetite and the intellectual space to think about the Middle East in interesting and robust fashion, we could become obsessed with Lebanon. We could become obsessed with Syria. We could become obsessed with what, I mean, there was an incredible revolution, an incredible amount of beautiful resistance that we saw in Sudan just a few months ago, and to see 12 seconds of it on the media was super disappointing. And then at the governmental level, and I promise I'll answer these faster, there's also the question of accountability. The United States has the ability to hold Saudi Arabia accountable, even for the just bizarre and disturbing, tragic Jamal Khashoggi ordeal, murder. There's the ability to hold nation states accountable. We actually have the political and economic leverage to make those things happen. And so I'd like to see us exercise that. I think the possibility is there. Am I as optimistic about that as I am about the people? No.
Okay, thank you. The first question from the audience is from Daoud Kuttab. How specifically can we make media gatekeepers to engage with authentic voices out there?
I always laugh when I meet people who talk about giving voice to the voiceless. I always feel like there's a sense of self-importance that I want to give voice to the voiceless. Like I always say, like, don't give voice to the voiceless, just pass the mic. You know, there are moments where I remember in 2014 when the 51-day war began in Gaza. I began to be used on television. I would often be put into these debates with Alan Dershowitz. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I should. And it was an interesting set of exchanges, and it was fun, and it was cool. But after like day 3, I was like, wait a minute, this isn't fair. We can have authentic voices if I say no and pass the mic. If I say no, bring Noda Erdogan on. No, bring whomever. I mean, it doesn't, you know, whoever you might want to pick. But bring Yusuf Munir in. Right? Bring in people who are on the ground doing this work who are Palestinian. That helps bring in an authentic voice. Now, authentic doesn't just mean being from the place, because you could be from the place and have bad politics. Zora Neale Hurston once said, all your skin folk ain't your kinfolk. So it's not enough to just have Palestinian voices if they're going to be on the wrong side of the issue. But I do think that's a start. Another thing is we have to vote with our feet. I mean, if we're having a conversation about the best way to get to a two-state solution, an authentic voice isn't just a Palestinian voice, it's a voice that says, wait a minute, what about other possibilities? What about a one-state solution? What about democratic? It should be part of the conversation. Whether you agree with the one-state solution or not, it should be part of the conversation. But we have to demand that. We have to say, I'm not going to watch this if you continue to have these types of representations. But unfortunately, because we don't have significant enough kind of mass investment in the issue, there's no one really pushing back on this.
The next question is from Jafari from Al Mayadeen Network. Amounts of money spent on U.S. media and trying to influence U.S. media by Arabs seem to be enormous these days.
Oh, yeah.
When we look back at other conflict areas and other cultures, like let's say the Vietnamese, they spent zero on trying to influence American media and opinion. Why were they successful and Arabs aren't?
Oh, that's a great question. One, I wouldn't say that Arabs are entirely unsuccessful. That's the first thing I would stipulate. I think that we have seen an extraordinary pushback and resistance to some of the dominant narratives of the last 30 or 40 years in the Middle East. Some of that is about the investment of Arab lobbies. Some of it is just, quite frankly, people seeing it more. You know, when you watch what happened in Gaza in 2014, for example, when you could see the explosions and you could see the children, similar to the effect of the representations of the Vietnam War 50 years prior, it shifted American public sentiment. When you can see the impact of disproportionate force in a region, it makes things look and feel different. However, some of the unsuccess, the lack of success that the question speaks to goes back to the initial point I made, which is a question about we could talk about racism, we could talk about Orientalism, but at the core, it's a question of white supremacy, and it's a question of Western supremacy. And it ultimately becomes a question of whose lives and whose bodies matter. As Judith Butler talked about, who's worth mourning? Because if I don't see bodies as mournable, if I don't see bodies as worth saving or investing in or protecting, then I won't be outraged no matter how much attention I draw to it. So if I drop $1 billion to show you all of the devastating impacts of not having electricity or potable water or freedom of movement in Gaza, that's great. But if I fundamentally believe that these are barbaric subhuman beings, then it's much more difficult to produce empathy and moral outrage. We can show famines in Ethiopia or in Eritrea or in Somalia in the 80s and 90s. We can show that, but if I fundamentally don't believe that Africans are human beings, then no matter how much money I get to showing you the problem, I will never get the same type of outcome I will for that really nice missing white woman in Spokane, Washington. And the truth is, they all deserve our mourning. They all deserve our outrage. They all deserve our sympathy. But we don't get it partly because of that. And then thirdly, there are, at the same time that there are groups pushing and advancing a I don't want to speak broadly about Arabs because I think there's so much geographic and nation-state specificity we have to have when we talk about this issue. But the groups that are pushing to advance the types of agendas and types of politics you're asking about, I think there are also groups that are pushing back and countervailing that, which is very different. Like there was no pro-famine group, right? Like so it's a very different type of issue, and so I think it produces different types of challenges.
Yasser Ali from CAP asks, do you still believe, based on your experiences, in U.S. values, or are these just for media consumption?
U.S. values, that's always I don't even know what that means, you know? So if the question is, do I believe, okay, so there's so many levels to that question. This is why you don't ask professors questions. So do I believe in the values that the United States expresses for itself around democracy and freedom and independence? Yes, of course I believe in democracy and freedom and independence. Do I believe that those are quintessentially United States values? Of course not. We are a settler colonial nation state produced out of the dislocation and ultimately, honestly, the expulsion and really the genocide of indigenous populations here in the United States. We are a nation state that was built, whose economy was built on cotton through the exploited labor of enslaved Africans. And we have expanded the American empire through those means, both in Latin America and in Latin America and in Africa, and of course, in the post-World War II moment in the Middle East. So, do I believe in American values? No. Now, the last part of that is, do I believe in the ability of America to be something else? I don't know. I never lose hope. I believe that this nation has grown, it's developed. We are more free today than we were at a different moment in very material ways. As the great-grandchild of slaves, I have to say that. I'd be dishonest not to say that. But do I believe in the kind of American exceptionalist narratives that suggest that we can nurture and export democracy around the globe, that we can save, to use Gayatri Spivak's language, that we can go around the world and save brown women, that white men can go and save brown women from brown men? No. Do I believe that America has something unique and special to teach the world about freedom, justice, and equality? Of course not. But do I believe we can be better than we are at this moment? Absolutely.
You know, you just mentioned the term exceptionalism. How about the other use of that same word, as if like the region you've been discussing is somehow accepted from democracy and freedom of expression and so on, and it's hopeless to keep talking about that possibility.
Again, because we construct, and Saeed talked about this much more brilliantly than I ever could, but because we imagine democracy as a uniquely Western product, and that only we can produce this thing and expand it, that will always create these narratives that the Arab world in particular is unready for civilization. It's unready for democracy. As an anthropologist, our discipline in many ways is founded on this premise that there are civilized nations and there are non-civilized nations. There are literate societies and illiterate societies, that there are modern societies and pre-modern societies. And too often we continue to construct and imagine the Middle East as a place that is pre-modern and therefore not ready for democracy because we don't believe, again, that they're fundamentally human. And so it's much more easy to create the exception, right? There's the exception for democracy, the exception for droning, the exception for freedom of movement, we love all that stuff till it's time to give it to people we don't want to give it to. And I think that the Middle East is not alone in that. I think if you were to look in Rwanda, or you were to go to Botswana right now, or you were to look at the effects of World Bank or IMF policy anywhere in the continent of Africa, you would see another place where we've decided that people aren't ready. The mandate period that exists in the Middle East, I'm making this point because the Middle East is the exception, but it's not the only exception. It's like it's brown people and black people are the exception, right? The mandate period that said that these nations aren't ready for post-World War I democracy extended into Southwest Africa. It extended into other places. So it's a very complicated but messy landscape until we dismantle and disrupt white supremacy, which is maybe the biggest of all tasks. We're always going to have these, and capitalism, of course, right? We're going to have these challenges.
Richard Coleman would like you to tell him, where do you draw the line? I mean, let's assume that there is a newsroom leader that decides to air a supporter of ISIS, for example, who argues about American hegemony that requires, or the only option required here is violent resistance.
That's tough. And of course, the ISIS question, it wasn't even like, okay. I'm already imagining the headlines, right?
Yeah.
It's a good question. I think that there should be multiple criteria for deciding whether a voice is worth spotlighting. I think there's a legitimate argument that we don't want and we should not give voice to active terrorist organizations. I think I agree with that position. I don't think that's a controversial. I don't think that's a controversial position as such. I think the challenge is not, the question for me is less about ISIS. It's not whether we wanted Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi to be like on like AC 360, right? To me, that's the easy one to say no, right? But what happens when we say that a democratically elected organization like Hamas, which has a legitimate which is a legitimate part of the conversation, or the PLO. What would we have said in 1988, right, or 1987? We're in the middle, or we're at the beginning of an intifada, and they're saying, well, no, the PLO is a terrorist organization, and so we can't have a conversation with them. At what moment do we decide? So I think I think there are outliers that we can probably say, you know what, that's probably, we could have a philosophical conversation about that, but I think we could agree that Boko Haram or ISIS may not be the people we want to interview for all sorts of practical and ethical reasons. But I do think that we can't say that just because someone has been deemed a terrorist by a state organization, right? The ANC, the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela's party was still a terrorist organization on our government's list during the Bush administration. Nelson Mandela technically couldn't travel. We allowed him, we made the exception for him, but he couldn't. So I'm not willing to allow that to be the thing. The second piece of that is the question of violence. I don't think that we can, as I said many times, I think that I am pro-peace. I support nonviolent resistance. I support nonviolent movements. But international law, and I think good common sense says that people who are being physically harmed have the right to defend themselves. And I certainly would allow room for someone in the conversation to be able to talk about their belief in their right to defend themselves. I don't think that is an absurd, I mean, we allow people on the news that will talk about arming elementary school teachers after a school shooting. I think that is a far more extremist and absurd position than telling someone who is under the foot of imperialism in a particular nation anywhere in the world that they have the right to armed resistance. I think we should be able to have that conversation. So at the philosophical level, I'm saying drawing the line is never, I don't like to draw absolutes like no terrorists or no pro-violence, because I think that there's too much nuance in how those terms are constructed. Those are all socially constructed terms. And so if you grew up in the American Western media landscape and you hear Houthi rebels, you start freaking out. It's only when you start reading books that you realize who you're supposed to be banging with and who you're not. So for me, I never want to think in absolute terms, but to have those elements in the newsroom of historical understanding, of informed analysis, et cetera, that will get us to a place, where we can make reasonable and nuanced conversations about who should be in the conversation, but not. But if I have to err on a side, just to tie this all up, I would rather err on the side of a newsroom and a public sphere that is more inclusive rather than less inclusive.
All right, there are a lot of questions that could keep us here for another hour, I think. But for the sake of brevity and trying to include at least several questions at one time, let me try to reduce 2 or 3 of them to a yes or no.
Okay.
Steve from Anira is saying that there is an opening recently. There has been an opening in on the political side.
Yes.
In terms of discussion on Palestine.
Yeah.
Do you think one could expect a similar opening on the editorial or media part, being a little bit more flexible or dealing with issues that you delineated that are not discussable at this time?
I think so. I can't say a pure yes, but I'll give a short answer. Mm-hmm. I think yes. I think as the politics expand, as you see political, Bernie Sanders just this week talked about making funding to Israel contingent on the humanitarian conditions in Gaza. What should be a moral common sense, like a no-brainer, is actually a kind of a radical move in American politics. That type of expansion leads to to a broader conversation on the editorial page, on TV, et cetera. So I think we're in the right direction. I think we're moving away from a singular narrative. I think things are getting better.
Safi Hamid from the Egyptian-American Relations Center is saying that their experience has been that the U.S. media seems to be like a closed fortress. Agree or not?
I'm really bad at saying yes or no to things like that because there's too much complexity.
Short answer.
I'm not sure exactly what he means. So a closed fortress in what way?
Very difficult to reach. This is typical of many in the Arab American communities.
Oh, yes.
As they try to work with the media.
I see. Yes, I think that's true. And I think that's a problem for many groups. I think two things. One, media outlets are particularly television media, which I can speak to more, is worried about what makes money. And so, and these stories, just because people don't care about Arab lives or Black lives or queer lives or trans lives, then we're not inherently going to cover it, right? And so they only cover it to the extent that it converges with their own interests. I think that's a significant challenge. And then the other challenge is, quite frankly, producers on television are risk averse. And they don't want to add new faces, the reason you see the same people on cable news every day is it's often because, I don't want to call them lazy. I think people are afraid of bringing someone new on. And so you see the same people, you see the same challenges, you see the same issues, you see the same rundowns every day because it works. And nobody wants to be the person that introduces something that doesn't work. Because if you introduce something that doesn't work, then you might be unemployed. They'll take credit for it if it works, and they'll all hide if it doesn't work. And so this becomes the challenge. And so you see fewer brown and Black faces, you see fewer brown and Black topics, partly because of the money piece and partly because of the risk aversion. Verseness, maybe? Yeah.
Let's conclude with the following question from Alison Glick, Churches for Middle East Peace. Is the experience you went through with that particular nameless network, was it related to increased and more visible solidarity within the African American community between Black intellectuals and activists regarding Palestine, or was it isolated just in terms of your case?
I think it was. There were multiple things. I think there's certainly, just to be clear, a long tradition of Black intellectuals and activists showing solidarity with Palestine. Noda Erdekat and I actually just curated a special issue of the Journal of Palestine Studies. So if you all want to read some really nerded out academic stuff, the whole special issue was on Black Palestinian transnational solidarity, and we get at some of these histories. That said, I think that I think since the uprisings in Ferguson in 2014, where you saw Palestinians on the ground in Ferguson protesting for Black lives, and you saw those very famous kind of exchanges and tweets, for example, between like Miriam Barghouti and Ferguson activists. People were in the West Bank. Miriam was in Ramallah talking to people in Ferguson. And they were telling folks, like, here's how you wash your eyes out. Here's how you make a mask out of a T-shirt to protect yourself from tear gas. Stand close to the soldiers. That way they can't tear gas you. Run toward the wind. It'll help you. So those types of practical strategies, they're like, look, we're Palestinian. We know tear gas, right? And so those types of conversations produce not just the kind of immediate solidarity, which I think is kind of ephemeral, it's passing, but it created a conversation about solidarity that then led people to go on delegations, it led people to write and do art exhibits and all kinds of renewed energy toward the question of Black Palestinian solidarity. And I think the media attention to that does create a certain type of concern for people who are trying to dismantle those relationships. Because you know that the wider the coalition, the broader the solidarity movement, the more successful justice struggle you will have. And so, you know, suddenly, and Allison is part of the church kind of community, so she understands this. Black churches have oftentimes been Zionist. Black churches are often funded to go and make these kinds of tours where they see a very particular type of Holy Land narrative of the region rather than an occupation narrative of the region. And so the kind of disruption of that narrative through these renewed Black Palestinian solidarities, I think are significant. And lastly, I say renewed because, you know, there is a long history from the 50s, certainly, we could look at folk, but by the time you get to the 1967 war, you got the Black Panthers, you got the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee devoting its whole July, August issue to the question of neocolonialism and the question of Palestine after the 1967 war, excuse me. You see a significant amount of energy through people like Angela Davis, continued. People like the early Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young in the 70s meeting with the PLO. I mean, there's so much energy. And so now that energy is renewed, and again, it's digital media, it's YouTube, it's all these other outlets that are showing those solidarities, that are broadcasting those connections. And I think that is the key to freedom. That is the key to justice, expanding our coalitions, thickening our democracy, and making sure that we understand that nobody is free until everybody is free.
Give Marc a hand.